For decades, millions have listened to Roy Orbison's haunting ballads without truly understanding the depths of darkness from which they emerged. Behind those iconic black sunglasses lay a man whose life was marked not by the glamour and success that his fans witnessed, but by a series of catastrophic losses that would have completely destroyed anyone less resilient. Only now, when we examine the totality of his personal struggles alongside his artistic evolution, can we truly understand the mystery of Roy Orbison and why his voice carried such profound emotional weight. The question has always been, how did a man endure such incomprehensible tragedy and still manage to create some of the most beautiful and emotionally resonant music of the 20th century? The answer reveals something far darker and more complex than simple perseverance. It speaks to the very nature of artistic genius, psychological trauma, and the human capacity to transform unbearable pain into transcendent art. When the world looked at Roy Orbison in the mid-1960s, they saw an exceptionally talented musician at the height of his fame. His marriage to Claudette Frady appeared to be the stuff of fairy tales. A beautiful woman, a successful career, adoring fans across the globe, and all the trappings of a life most people could only dream of. Yet beneath this polished surface lay a marriage on the verge of collapse, a betrayal so personal it would shake the very foundation of Roy's emotional being. The affair between Claudette and Braxton Dixon, the contractor building their new home, wasn't merely an infidelity. It was a betrayal by someone Roy trusted implicitly. This wasn't a stranger. This was someone who would enter his home every day, someone embedded in his innermost circle. For Roy, a man whose entire artistry depended upon feeling deeply, upon channeling raw emotion into his performances, this moment of betrayal would echo through every note he sang for the remainder of his life. What's particularly striking is how Roy handled this public humiliation. He didn't cry out, didn't rage, didn't expose his heartbreak for the world to dissect. Instead, he did what he had always done. He internalized it. He fired Braxton Dixon. He finished building the house himself. He continued performing. He appeared to move forward. But anyone who listened carefully to his music after this period could hear the difference. A deeper melancholy, a more profound understanding of loneliness and abandonment that transcended typical heartbreak. The reconciliation with Claudette came swiftly. By December 1965, just months after their divorce was finalized, they remarried. On the surface, this appeared to be a triumphant return to love, a second act where two people could repair what had been broken. But here's where the mystery deepens. Did Roy truly forgive the betrayal, or did he simply choose to endure it? Was their reunion a genuine healing, or was it two people trying desperately to salvage something that had been irreparably damaged? The truth, lost to history, seems to rest somewhere in the unspoken space between these two possibilities. On June 6, 1966, barely 6 months after their remarriage, Roy Orbison's carefully constructed world collapsed completely and catastrophically. He and Claudette were returning home on their motorcycles from Bristol, Tennessee, a shared passion, a moment of freedom and joy, when a pickup truck collided with her motorcycle in Gallatin, Tennessee. The impact was violent and sudden. Claudette was launched through the air, and when she arrived at the hospital, the extent of her liver injuries proved unsurvivable. She died at just 25 years old, leaving Roy a widower and making him a single father to Roy Jr., Anthony, and their youngest son Wesley. This wasn't an abstract loss. This was the woman who had inspired "Oh Pretty Woman," one of his greatest compositions. This was the woman he had reconciled with after profound betrayal, the woman with whom he had rebuilt his life. And now she was gone, taken in an instant by pure chance, by a moment of terrible timing on a Tennessee road. What makes this tragedy even more incomprehensible is that Roy had been given a glimpse of redemption. The reconciliation had felt real. They had another child. They were back together, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though their love story might have a happy ending after all. Then came the motorcycle accident, and everything dissolved into grief. The psychological impact on Roy would be immeasurable. Here was a man who had already learned that betrayal could come from within his inner circle, who had experienced the sting of infidelity, who had fought to rebuild his marriage, only to have death snatch away any possibility of a true resolution. Claudette's death meant that some conversations would never happen, some forgiveness might never be fully achieved, and some wounds would never be given the chance to properly heal. If Claudette's death was a tragedy of circumstance, then what happened next can only be described as a relentless assault by fate itself. Roy tried to move forward. He channeled his grief into work, collaborating on projects, attempting to rebuild his career in a changing musical landscape. He was beginning to stabilize his life when he received word that would shatter whatever fragile foundation he had rebuilt. While he was on tour in Birmingham, England on September 14, 1968, his house in Hendersonville, Tennessee caught fire. The blaze spread rapidly, consuming the entire structure. Inside were his two eldest sons, Anthony and Roy Jr., and despite the best efforts of emergency responders, both boys perished in the flames. This wasn't just another tragedy. This was the annihilation of Roy Orbison's present and future simultaneously. He had lost his wife, the woman who had inspired his greatest love songs. Now he had lost two of his children, the living reminders of his life with Claudette, the tangible connections to his past and to her memory. Authorities would later suggest that a lacquer aerosol may have been the ignition source, but identifying the cause did nothing to alleviate the catastrophic loss. Two young boys, full of potential, gone in flames. The father who had survived infidelity and the death of his wife now had to survive the death of his sons. Friends and colleagues reported that Roy was fundamentally changed by this event. The gregarious musician became withdrawn. The man who found solace in creation could no longer write music. His sanctuary, the place where he had always been able to transform pain into art, was suddenly inaccessible to him. The fire had burned away not just his house, but his ability to process trauma through the only mechanism that had ever truly worked for him. Johnny Cash, his friend, would eventually purchase the property and rebuild. But years later, Cash's own house on that same land would also burn down, adding another layer of tragedy and mystery to the location. It was as though the ground itself had absorbed the grief and was determined to perpetuate it across generations. Everyone knows about Roy Orbison's black sunglasses. The story, repeated countless times, is that he forgot his prescription glasses on a plane before a Beatles tour in 1963 and was forced to wear dark prescription sunglasses as a practical alternative. From there, they became his signature, his look, the defining visual element of his public persona. But this narrative, while technically accurate, misses something crucial. By the time Roy Orbison was wearing those sunglasses regularly, he wasn't a man seeking style or attempting to cultivate a mysterious image. He was a man who had experienced betrayal, abandonment, the death of his wife, and the death of two of his children. Those sunglasses weren't fashion. They were armor. They were a barrier between his devastated inner world and the expectations of a public that wanted him to smile, to perform, to be the voice of romance and emotion. The mystery isn't why he wore the sunglasses. It's what they protected. Behind them was a man who had seen the absolute worst that life could offer. Behind them was someone who knew that love could be betrayed, that marriages could be destroyed, that children could be snatched away in an instant. Those dark lenses were a way of controlling how much of his pain the world could see. What's particularly tragic is that Roy had already been dealing with vision problems his entire life. He had worn corrective spectacles since childhood due to his poor eyesight. So the sunglasses weren't just a recent adoption. They were a continuation of something that had always been part of his physical reality. But in the context of his adult life, after all the losses, they took on a completely different significance. They became the visual manifestation of his emotional armor. In 1968, amid the aftermath of the fire and the overwhelming grief that followed, Roy Orbison met Barbara Wellhonen, a young German woman of 16, in London. On the surface, this relationship seems problematic by modern standards, and the age difference and circumstances certainly warrant critical examination. But in the context of Roy's life trajectory, it represented something else, an attempt to build new meaning in a life that had been systematically destroyed. Roy married Barbara in 1969, and together they began to construct a different kind of life. Wesley, his youngest son from his marriage to Claudette, was being raised by Roy's parents. With Barbara, Roy would have two more sons, Roy Jr., born in 1970, and Alexander, born in 1975. These weren't replacements for the sons he had lost. Nothing could ever be that. But they were new chances, fresh beginnings, and an opportunity to be a father in a different context, free from the shadow of the greatest tragedy imaginable. What's remarkable about this period is how Roy managed to continue creating, performing, and engaging with the music industry despite the fact that a large part of him had been destroyed. He couldn't have fully processed his trauma. The psychological work required to heal from the loss of a spouse and two children is something many people never recover from at all. Yet Roy found a way to continue, to marry again, to have new children, and to attempt to rebuild something resembling a normal life. This wasn't the path of someone who had truly healed from his wounds. Rather, it was the path of someone who had chosen to keep moving forward despite carrying those wounds with him. It was an act of remarkable resilience, but also of remarkable denial. To function, to perform, to smile for photographers, to be a father again, all of this required Roy to compartmentalize his grief in ways that must have been psychologically devastating. By the late 1980s, Roy Orbison experienced a remarkable professional resurgence. His work with the Traveling Wilburys alongside George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne brought him back into the public consciousness. The album Mystery Girl, released in early 1989, became his best-selling record of all time. The single You Got It, which he co-wrote with Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne, introduced his music to a new generation. But here's what makes this posthumous success particularly poignant. Roy died on December 6, 1988, just weeks before Mystery Girl would achieve its remarkable commercial and critical success. He never got to fully experience the redemption that his final album represented. He never got to see how his work would continue to resonate with audiences decades after his death. He never got to witness the full arc of his artistic rehabilitation. The mystery that's being solved here isn't a secret conspiracy or hidden truth waiting to be exposed. It's something more subtle and more tragic. The realization that Roy Orbison's entire artistic legacy is inseparable from the catastrophic losses he experienced. Every beautiful ballad, every soaring vocal performance, every emotionally devastating composition carries within it the weight of his accumulated trauma. Oh Pretty Woman was inspired by Claudette. Crying captures the essence of grief and longing. Only the Lonely speaks to isolation and abandonment. When we listen to these songs now, knowing the full context of Roy's life, they become even more powerful. They are not just beautiful pieces of music. They are artifacts of someone who has known genuine despair. The real mystery that has been solved is this: Roy Orbison's voice was powerful not despite his suffering, but because of it. His ability to connect with listeners, to make them feel genuine emotion, to transport them to places of profound longing and melancholy. All of this was directly connected to his personal tragedies. A man who had not experienced such profound loss could never have